NIMS Nubs Part 2. Let's recap a couple things that we talked about in round 1. Um, the first and biggest problem is that, in Bronze Age, you're planning some 2x2, 3x3 stuff, and then as your city evolves and you're expanding, those roads are not necessarily being used optimally. That's problem number 1. And by the time you wake up in Titan and realize that, you probably got chaos on your hands. That's the obvious problem number 1. So we looked at the Christmas tree pattern, which will get you about 100% efficiency. Pretty reliable system. There's not really any serious problems with it. You'll get 100%, but you're not going to exceed that. So if you are trying to optimize your space and pack in a couple more Feta farms or whatever trinket you're after, if you're trying to pack in a few more of those, you need to get above 100% road efficiency. So the first problem that we looked at with the Christmas tree pattern is row height and the fact that it's inflexible. So I have this back row set up 5 tall. I'm ending this row with 2 large buildings that are connected by a single road, and we talked about that as a benefit to the system, right? But let's say the next building that comes out is not 5x5, it's actually 3x7. Smaller footprint, right? But it's clearly not going to fit in there, okay? And I can maybe stuff it in the row behind it, but it might cause interference with the opposite side of that row, whatever this row height is paired with, right? And this is where you would end up with this awkward 1x1 stuff where, yeah, you can fit it in there, but it's not necessarily the best use of your roads or your city real estate. If you could compress that row, right, and move all the road lists to the bottom, you would gain efficiency, but then you got to reorganize your whole city, and that sounds like an absolute nightmare. So the second problem that we talked about is that we've gained efficiency here on the Celtic Tavern and the Chateau because they're both really large buildings and we've connected them by a single road. So that's a benefit. The problem with the Christmas tree design is that you don't have enough road terminations to accommodate all of these large buildings. So inevitably, some of these are going to end up inside of a row or a column and connected along one full face of the building, if that makes sense. So now we have large buildings inside of a row or a column, and in a perfect world, we would be able to run all these long, skinny buildings just side by side down a continuous column, right? But if we're using the Christmas tree pattern, that column is interrupted by rows every 8 or 10 squares, right? And we talked about stuffing it in the corner. That's obviously not efficient, so we can kind of insulate that with some 2x2, right? But ultimately, that 4x6 building is still connected along 6 faces of the building when it is most efficient at 4. So we're getting a couple penalties here. This 2x2 is expecting 2 faces of road. It's connected by 4, and the ship is connected on 6 where it expects 4. So there's a penalty of 4 roads essentially. And you might look at that and say, well, there's not a better way to connect it, but there is, and the fact that you've consumed 4 extra roads to make those connections is kind of proof in the pudding, okay? So let's see. Row height, yes, we covered row height. We covered the large buildings inside rows, columns. I think we're all caught up to speed on why the Christmas tree pattern is not the best solution, right? So all that's pretty common sense, but going forward, where do we even start, right? I've got 5 decades of hardware in here and I have no idea how to organize it. So I'm going to show you my nub system. Hopefully it works for you guys. Step number one, in the first video I explained to you that the Christmas tree pattern uses connections off of all 4 sides of the town hall. I do mine a little bit different. I actually only use 3 connections, and 2 of them are single roads, okay? So this is similar to my current setup. It's a little different, but it's pretty much the same idea. I have the one main road coming out of the town hall, and then I have 2 single pieces of road on either corner of the town hall that are connecting some of my larger buildings, but also my most irregular buildings. So I only have one building that's 5 by 6 dimension. I have a handful of taverns, but it's a large building. I only have 2 buildings, road buildings, that are 5 by 5. I only have 1 building that's a 4 by 7, and I only have 1 building that's a 7 by 7. So they're large buildings to start with, but they're also irregular shapes. And part of the key to the nub pattern is having consistently shaped buildings. So if you have a bunch of 4 by 4, that'll work. If you have a bunch of 4 by 5, that'll work. But irregular shaped buildings don't really work very well with the pattern. So I have AO space carrier. I gotta move my screen record button. It's interfering with my ability to press buttons. CDM, Chateau, there's a Zeus back here, and then Celtic Tavern. So total of 174 building squares, and they're all connected by 2 individual pieces of road. So automatically I've got a pretty decent head start on my roads, right? From here, we're going to take one main column and run that into the city. I'm going to zoom out so you can start seeing the setup. Next step in the process is to find the widest point in your city, left to right. The system works a lot better with a long continuous row versus combination of row and column. It works better in a large continuous row. I've been very intentional about maxing out my city expansions left to right. You can make this system work if your city is more oriented vertically. You can make it work, but if you do have expansions available to you, probably start placing them on the left and the right. Another quick note on expansions, just to throw that out there, I've also been very intentional about maxing out my expansions on the top and the right side specifically, because all of your future expansions are going to be down here, right? And I can adjust my buildings into the space as I get those expansions. But it's nice having all my permanent buildings, like AO is not going to get deleted, you know? So this is a permanent building in my opinion. And it's nice having this building fixed into a part of the map that is also not going to change, just so that as new buildings come out, I don't have to rearrange, you know, Chateau is not going to get deleted. Space Carrier might, that's kind of a side note, but for the most part, these are permanent buildings, right? Like my arc is not going to get deleted. So that's on a part of the map that is fixed and is not gonna change, okay? So from here we find the widest part of the map. So I don't start this nub pattern back here, right? Because it kind of bottlenecks. So I start this nub pattern up here on the very widest part of the map, if that makes sense. The goal here is to get all of our repeatable sizes in this center group. I'm going to start dropping these in just so you can see it kind of materialize. This is the end goal of the nub pattern, right? And these would be medium or large buildings, but the key here is that they're consistently shaped, or at least consistent groups. So I have Oris that are 5 tall, taverns that are 5 tall, I have a bunch of ships that are 4 tall, I have a bunch of animal crossings that are 3 tall. So they're not the same dimensions, but I have multiple of each size. That's kind of the key here. Before we come back to that though, go around your outside now and pick your largest irregular sized buildings, and we're going to set these up with a little nub, right? It's that single piece of road that connects a large building and a large building with a single piece of road. I only have 2 buildings that are 5 by 7 and only 2 buildings that are 6 by 6. So those are a good candidate for this spot, okay? I have, I think, 4 buildings that are 4 by 5 dimension. Don't have a ton of them. I do have a couple though. That's going to be the big step. I only have 2 autumn vineyards, and it's a large building. It's 21 squares, but it's also irregular, considering I only have 2 of them, right? So this is probably not a good candidate for this nub group, okay? So from here, we're going to set up our internal row height with this main group. And there's a couple different variables here, but it's pretty universal and pretty easy to adjust based on the hardware that you have. Variable number 1 is how many alternating dimensions you have. So this is 4 tall, this is 5 tall. That's variable number 1. And in that case, you can run, you would run your row up to the end of this 4 tall and the side of this 5 tall. That's one way to do it. This method would depend on also having a lot of 2 by 2 as well as 2 by 3 dimensions to pack into each spot, if that makes sense. Let me find, yeah, there you go. So I'll have 2 by 2 over here and then 2 by 3 over here, if that makes sense. I do have a lot of 5 tall as well as a lot of 4 tall, but I don't have a lot of 2 tall. So that method is not really ideal for the hardware that I have. So the other way to do it is to keep all of your 4 tall buildings to where everything, all your filler is just 2 by 3, and then run your road in between those buildings, if that makes sense. So in this example, the road terminates on top of the 4 tall building, and in this example, the road terminates in between the 4 tall buildings. Either way works, it just depends on the hardware that you have. So I have a lot of jester stages, obviously, which is why my nub group is set up with mostly the 4 tall stuff on the inside. Here's some of the cool things about this system. There is more to it, but I'm going to make a quick note on this part. Let's say these 4x6s become obsolete, which they probably will, knowing the way that Inno works. I can replace those with pairs of other dimensions, just swap them out directly, and it still maintains the same internal row height. And if you remember back here earlier with the vineyard example, the inflexibility of the Christmas tree pattern with row height is a big disadvantage. And it's not the end of the world, but you'd end up rearranging your city literally every time a new building dimension comes out. This is actually pretty flexible, so we can substitute 4x4, 5x3, 6x2, however that works out. The other cool thing is that it's not really affected a whole lot by length either. So let's say those 4x6s become obsolete, and the next cool thing is 4x5, right? Same height, just a different width. we just take that pattern and shift it over. And if, you know, if we had gestures in here before, we would just pull that gesture out and put it on the opposite side of the row that we just shifted, if that makes sense. So it's actually flexible left to right as well as vertically. Let me get some of these out of here. I'll pause it real quick. I'm going to get this. All right, so that's good to go. From here, we're just going to start plugging in all of our 2x2 and 2x3 stuff. So far, actually most of my large hardware is already planted. Let's see, that's all road list. There's some nutcrackers, 2x2, road, a couple pumpkins. All that's road list. A couple 1x2 roads, a couple 1x3 roads. And then these taverns and orries down at the bottom. Let's see, great buildings, I've got a 5x5 and a couple 4x4. So at this point, all of my buildings that are 3x3 or larger are planted on the field. And you can see that I still have 11 roads to spare and plenty of usable road connections, right? And all of my large buildings are already planted. Everything else is literally just the 1x1 or 1x3, 2x3 stuff. So I'm going to keep using gestures as an example, just because I got plenty of them. So we're going to fill these 2x3 gaps in, right? From here we can fine tune it a little bit. So this gesture is not necessarily efficiently connected. 2 roads would be an ideal connection. We're using 5, 2 on the face, 3 on the side, right? Not necessarily the best connection. Better way to do that would be to shift this gesture and do a continuous row at the bottom, and I'll come back to that. And then insulate that corner as well with 1x3 or 1x1. So this Rune Garden is expecting 1 connection, it gets that. That's expecting 1 connection. Shroom Throne is expecting 1 connection. Both those meet that criteria. This shroom is expecting 1 road connection. It actually has 2, right? So that's the only inefficient building in this entire group, is a Shroom Throne that's connected on 2 sides instead of 1. And where we're compensating there is the 2 ships behind it that are expecting 4 connections, and the 2 of them share 1 connection. So it's 0.5 connections per ship, if that makes sense. So that 0.5 connection actually cancels out the penalty of 1, if that makes sense. Plus the gain of 3 roads, where if this was in a continuous column, it would be connected to 4 pieces of road. It's connected to 0.5 pieces of road. So let's see. Yep, continue this pattern, and then same thing at the ends. We're just going to plug in our remaining large buildings at the end of this system with that alternating dimension, right? So that pretty much takes care of this center group. Let's look at the bottom here. I always set up my bottom this way for a couple different reasons. Primary reason for me is that I have a lot of gesture and gators, so the row height is kind of determined by that. If you had a bunch of Stage of Ages at 4x4, you would adjust this row height accordingly. And at that's not a huge penalty, is having a continuous row of 4 tall buildings. It's literally the same efficiency as having a gator that expects 2 roads connected by 2, or an Ori expecting 4 roads connected by 4. It's literally the same efficiency either way. So this bottom group, I don't do a nub pattern on. I just use a continuous group of smaller buildings. Couple different reasons for this. Number one, if I get building dimensions that are that I can't adjust in this main group, I can adjust at the bottom, because at the end of this row I just keep all my road list stuff, okay? And there's 1 by 1, 1 by 3, there's all sorts of different dimensions of road lists. So Ori is 20 squares, Vineyard is 21, but they obviously have a very different shape, right? If that makes sense. So if I have Oris and the new building that comes out is 3 by 7, I can store my Oris, plant my vineyards in that location, and just rearrange the road list around it to accommodate that different shape. It's the same number of squares, so it's not like I'm going to end up storing road lists. I've just got to rearrange the shape of the road list, if that makes sense. The other reason I do it this way, so this is how my city's set up, and this is how I set up other cities that I've designed. I terminate this bottom row kind of open-ended. The reason for this is, let's say gators become obsolete and Theta 2.0 is the next cool thing. We can start storing those gators, right? And then filling in more Theta, if that makes sense. Or vice versa, Theta becomes obsolete, so we need to now extend this row and plant more Gator version 2s, okay? And we have the ability to do that as well. So this bottom row, this section serves two purposes. It's the flexibility with height that doesn't fit, that is too irregular to fit in this center group. So that gives me flexibility on the bottom side of this row down here. And it also gives me flexibility to switch between roadless or road, depending on what new buildings come out. And the way that NO, the trends that they've been setting lately, there is a lot of variety in these buildings that are coming out right now. Not just in dimensions, but in road versus roadless, as well as stats, all, you name it. So Jester's 2x3 road connection, I think it's a great building, but maybe the next thing that comes out is 2x3 but roadless, right? And if I just store my Jesters and plug a roadless 2x3 in there, there's a 2x2, let's use that. I'm using unnecessary roads for buildings that should be outside of that road boundary, if that makes sense. So this system down here gives me the flexibility to just store these individually one at a time, and then plant the roadless where it should be behind that road, right? And then reduce the number of roads that I'm consuming. So remember what I said in the first video. It seems kind of pedantic, but this 1, 2, 3, 4 is an airship, right? So if the system that I'm using to swap out road versus roadless is just putting the roadless on the road connection, these two buildings are consuming 4 pieces of road that I don't need, that is the same footprint as another roadless building that's actually worth having, right? So this flexibility down here is huge benefit to me in my city. Let's see, I'm going to pause it. Let me think about what else I want to communicate. So in terms of insulating inside corners, I forgot to mention this. This 2x3 is inefficient, same scenario that we looked at with the Jester on the other side, because it's connected to 3 as well as 2, so that's inefficient. You can insulate that with a 1x3 and some 1x1s. You can also insulate it with a 2x2 and a pair of 1x1s, just depending on the hardware that you have. This is also the same, this group and this group are the same efficiency. This is looking for 2 connections, which it has. This is looking for 1, it has 2, and then one connection. So both systems have everything connected efficiently with the exception of the 1x1 in the corner. It just depends on the hardware that you have. I think that pretty much covers it. As you go through and fill in all of your small buildings, so there's a 3x3. That's relatively large considering what else we have left on the table, right? Try to put these remaining kind of medium-sized buildings at the edges of this nub group. So this is expecting 4 connections. I've been able to do it with 2. OBS is expecting 3 connections. I'm able to do it with 1 at that point, right? I'm sure we can find other clever ways to tuck some stuff in here. I mean, yeah, we could put our AI right there on the corner, connected by 1 where it expects 5. Little stuff like that. And at this point, it's just kind of trial and error, guess and check, see where stuff ends up. Worst case scenario, though, at this point, I mean, absolute worst case scenario, you just plug a 3x3 building alongside the full face of a road where it expects 3 connections. That's like absolute worst case scenario. Pegasus expects 4 connections. We're getting 4 connections out of that. This inside corner, I probably don't want to put a 3x3 in there, but if I do some 1x1 and adjuster, that's going to get me pretty much optimal efficiency, right? And I still have roads left over for these connections, right? So this is what my teammates affectionately called NIMS nubs. The pattern is incredibly simple, and once you strip away all the small stuff on the inside here, you can see that the skeleton of it is actually really easy to duplicate regardless of what your hardware mix is. Like if you have a bunch of 2x2 road connections, you'll just change the row height on your internal nubs there. If you have more great buildings, I deleted Traz, but if you have Traz, this would be a good Traz location. Let's say you don't have Saturn GB yet, but you have a 4x5, that would fit perfectly there. It's pretty flexible to basically any combination of hardware. And then same thing down here, if you don't have 3x3s, but you have a bunch of 4x4s, you would just increase this row height and run your 4x4s in a continuous group down here. So the cool thing about this system, the Christmas tree that we looked at has one main column, right? And then 20 different arteries coming off of it, if you will. This nub pattern essentially, well, it eliminates 90% of your rows, but it essentially consolidates your column into chunks of column, where this 4x6 would be efficiently connected along the length of a column. But instead of connecting it along the full length of the column, I've connected it to one corner of a partial column, if that makes sense. So I'm essentially taking that one large main column and breaking it into just the 3 pieces of column that I actually need to accomplish those connections. And then on the inside of that pattern, I'm using rune gardens to insulate that, but you could also use 1x2, 1x1, and then just plug some roadless stuff in between as a filler. So a lot of different ways to manipulate that hardware. I've designed, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 cities at this point, and many of them are actually in the top 50 in Conrear in terms of player ranking, and everyone has a different combination of hardware, expansions, not just expansion quantity, but expansion placement. So there's a lot of different variables in city design, but this pattern is pretty much universal. So hopefully it helped. Drop me a subscribe because I would appreciate some traffic on my YouTube. Anyways, hope it helped. God bless. Take care, guys.